Hello everybody. This is the first class, the first video class I should say, the first video for class session 2. I have an incorrect date here, so I'll delete that. So I'll make this comment that this is the comment that I make always at the beginning of these. Unless I make an egregious mistake, I'm just going to keep going. And you just saw an example right there. So let's just jump right into it. This is the XML fundamentals session. This is session 2. This is an online session. These are the slides to cover the concepts for the second session, XML fundamentals. Some of the slides are repeats from class 1. This is an online session, and it's very important that you view the video and then follow the instructions along the way. So I will demonstrate a little session project for you to do, and it's important that you do these in real time as you're watching this video, because these things will build and be used as we do our actual projects for this, the assigned projects for this class. So, and this is something that you're familiar with. The usual cadence here is that I show the first row is today's class. So today's class is XML fundamentals. Hopefully you will have already read the assignment there, the W3 Schools XML tutorials. Hopefully you found those easy and pretty straightforward. So we're going to talk about XML, why do we care? We're going to talk about elements and attributes, well-formed versus valid, and XSLT. Next week, we will have an in-class session, and that will be on web browser content. So that'll be the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and we'll hit you right out of the gate with a quiz. The quiz will be over the XML, essentially the slides that we're going over today. Okay, so for today's exercise, it's very important that you have a good text editor. So if you haven't done so already, please download a good text editor. I've put a couple of them on the D2L. There's Notepad++ for Windows users, and there's Text Wrangler for Mac users. I also, I think if you're a Mac user, another really good one that I haven't put in the the D2L is Sublime Text, and I would recommend going to that website there and installing that and seeing if you like it. So let's start right off the bat with an exercise, creating our web tools for content providers workspace. So the steps that you'll do is you will, and I'm going to demonstrate this in a second here, you'll create a folder on your desktop and you'll name it WT4CP, and inside that directory or folder, you'll create a bunch of subfolders. So let's, and then we'll download everything and put it in the from the resources tab of the D2L, and we'll put it in the downloads folder. Okay, so let's pause there, and I'm going to go ahead and walk you through that. So the first thing we'll do, and this is a slightly different procedure for Mac and Windows. I assume that you know how to create folders, so I won't go over the steps on how to do that in the Mac. If you have any trouble, please let me know. So we're going to call this Web Tools for Content Providers. Okay, it's important that you don't necessarily have to do this on your desktop, but it would help, because as we get into further projects, we will have a situation where you'll be using, I'll be telling you to do command line maneuvers, and it'll be much easier for you if you name these folders the same way that I named them, so that we're all kind of going off of the same system here. So I'm going to create a folder here called admin, and I'm going to create a folder called data, and I'm going to create a folder called downloads. I'm going to create a folder called slides. And I'm going to create a folder called translate or xlate. create a folder called XML. Okay. Then I'm going to go to my D to L site, and I'm going to download from the Resources tab everything that's in there, and I'm going to put it in my Downloads directory. Okay, so through the magic of encapsulated time, I've just simulated that. So these are all of the things that you'll get from that Resources directory, and just put them in your Downloads tab. So that concludes the exercise, the first exercise for this online session. Let's go back to slides, and then we will continually build on this, not only for this session, but also in future sessions and in the actual projects that you are assigned, which we will go over in class next week. Okay, XML, what's it all about? XML is Extensible Markup Language. It's a W3C standard. It's at that URL there. It's a text-based markup format. XML is the method for creating, editing, storing, and processing electronic data and documents. XML is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's in your car. It's in your phone. It's on the website all over the place. It's in your watch if you have an Apple Watch like I have, or one of the wearables. It's literally everywhere. And XML is the standard in which DITA is modeled. It's the standard in which HTML is modeled. It's the standard in which XLIF are modeled, and a lot of the other open standards that we care about. So this is a little bit confusing to some people, so I'll just kind of go over it again. XML is kind of like the rules. There are elements, there are attributes. The elements are in less than sign, greater than sign. There are comments and processing instructions. This is basically the syntax for creating other markup languages. And then, for example, DITA has its own set of rules that are in XML, as does HTML and XLIF and some of the other open standards that we'll be talking about. So why do we care? This class is about web tools for content providers. Nearly all web tools use an XML vocabulary. Browsers render HTML. HTML is an XML vocabulary. Content providers use more and more are using component content management systems like EasyData is the one that we'll use in this class, and XML tools to create and manage content. Content providers are expected to manage translation of content, and translation tools use XML. So really, why do we care? A good web content provider understands XML and can troubleshoot XML at the code level. So for example, this is rendered XML. This is our website, or at least it was the website as it was when I took this snapshot. It's rendered nicely in the browser, but if you were to do a view source on the browser rendered HTML, you would see that it's actually XML. The way you do that is that you right-click and you pick your view page source. And right up top, we have this thing called a doc type declaration. And we'll learn more about this a few slides later. But this tells us that not only is this XML, but this is valid XML, and it's valid per that DTD that they show there. And we'll get more into DTDs in a little bit here. And then the underlying XML, in this case, you can see that there's a div, and it's coded up nicely, and it shows this information, which when it's in a browser is rendered in a human readable form. So XML is primarily made up of elements and attributes. So XML element basics. An element is the most basic XML building block. Every XML file must contain at least one element. An XML file can consist of just one or many elements have names. There's a set of rules there at that URL around the rules for naming elements. So element versus tag. A lot of people talk about tags, so there's a difference. An element, they're actually both the same thing, but they're conceptually different. Elements have a start tag and an end tag. In the case of an empty element, the end tag is implied. The start tag has a less than character, followed by a name, followed by 0 or more attributes, followed by a greater than character. And here's an example. We have a concept. In this case, it has a space, and then an attribute called ID, an attribute value of C1, and then it terminates or it closes the element start tag with the greater than sign. The end tag has the same thing, a less than followed by a slash character, followed by the name, followed by the greater than character. So in this case, we have the start tag is here concept, and then the end tag as the angle slash concept angle. An empty element, and this is you will see this on your quiz, a question around empty elements is perfectly legal. So it has the the less than character, followed by the name, followed by 0 or more attributes, followed by slash, followed by the less than or greater than character, and it looks kind of like this. This is a BR tag. There is no terminating end tag like concept had. We just know that by the fact that there's a slash and a greater than, then this is an empty element. A non-empty element is a start tag and an end tag and everything between, which can be other elements, text, or attributes. Little note there can also be comments or processing instructions or CData sections, but we're not going to talk about those for this introductory class. An empty element is an element with no content. The representation of an empty element is either a start tag immediately followed by an end tag or an empty element tag, which we just showed you the version of the BR tag in the previous slide. Examples of elements. This first bullet, hello world, this whole thing, not just the start tag, not just the end tag, but the start tag and the text and the end tag, this whole thing is considered an element. And the second bullet, document with attribute and some sub elements and an empty element and a bunch of text, followed by terminated by the end tag. This whole thing is one element. And then, of course, there's an empty element. In this case, it's an empty element with no content, but it does have attributes. And then the following is not an element. It's just a start tag. If it had a closing paragraph tag or if it was an empty element, then it would be considered an element. But in this case, it's just a tag, start tag. So that was elements. Now let's go into attributes. An attribute is information about its host element. An XML element may have 0 or more attributes. An attribute, when present, is part of the start tag. Attributes have names, and then the rules around the naming conventions are here at this URL. An attribute has a name followed by an equals sign character followed by either what we call a double quote or a single quote. In real life, they call those apostrophes or quote marks, but in coding we call it a single quote or a double quote, followed by a value, followed by a single or double quote. For example, ID equals C1, that's an attribute, or name equals Telecaster, that's an attribute. You should be careful when you're using the Mac text editor because it inserts curly apostrophes or curly quote marks, and those are technically not legal in XML for attributes. Okay, so attributes versus elements. Everybody's got a different rule of thumb. My rule of thumb is that element is the noun and attribute is the adjective. So in this apple element, we see that the name of the element is apple, and then the adjectives are the attributes: size, medium, price, inexpensive. Okay. Other parts of XML worth mentioning, and for purposes of this class, it's important to know the names of these other things, but we're not going to use them at all. Well, actually, we will use the XML declaration. You'll need to know about that, and a doc type definition. Or doc type declaration. That's bullet 1 and bullet 2. XML comment is something that you'll see, but we will not necessarily use in this class. A processing instruction has the question marks there, Java table post processor. We won't be using that in this class either. And certainly a CData section. I could have a whole class on CData sections, but we won't talk about those. These are considered to be more advanced than what we will be dealing with in this class. You will see doc type declarations and you will see XML declarations, and in fact, expect to see those on the quiz. Okay. So putting it all together, You have, in this case, an XML declaration, and it has to have this exact syntax, the question mark on either end. There's a doc type declaration, and it has to have this what we call angle bang. That's the less than and the exclamation point followed by the word doc type. And we'll talk about what that means in a few slides. And then we have elements and attributes and content. In this case, we have a comment here. Okay, so that's kind of what XML looks like when it's put all together. So I talked about that DTD and that doc type declaration. What that has to do is well-formed versus valid XML. Now I'm going to say something very important here, and this will be on the quiz. Every XML document or every XML file must be well-formed. XML files that are valid are optional. So to be valid against a DTD or schema is optional. That's not required for every XML file, but every XML file is required to be well-formed. So why do we care about that particular aspect? Web content providers create and interact with several XML vocabularies that require the syntax to be valid. HTML files that are not valid will cause problems for the content management systems and in some cases display improperly. However, browsers will accept well-formed HTML that's not valid. That's very interesting. Data files that are malformed or invalid will not process. Translation files like XLIF, TMX, TBX, which we will talk about in further future modules, will not process. Despite how good the tools are, there will come a time in most content providers' careers that they will need to troubleshoot malformed or invalid XML. One of those why do we care statements. And hint, hint, usually when you see those, it means it's going to be a question on a quiz. Well-formed versus valid. Okay, so an XML document with correct syntax is called well-formed. And that just means that the angles are in the right place and that everything is marked up the way it is supposed to be marked up per this URL here. XML documents validated against an XML DTD or a schema are well-formed and valid, and the rules for validation are here at this URL. So well-formed, there are a lot of rules. It must begin and end with all the begin, end, and empty tag elements that delimit the element are correctly nested with none missing or none overlapping. So a correctly nested means that we have this paragraph start that starts and a paragraph start tag that ends. Within it, we have a bold that starts and ends, and we have an italic that starts and ends, and everything is correctly nested. An incorrect version of this is that the paragraph start tag is correct, but the bold tag starts and terminates, and the italic tag starts and terminates outside is not nested correctly. Element tags are case sensitive, so in this case paragraph start tag, paragraph end tag match, so that's correct. But in this case paragraph start tag does not match uppercase paragraph end tag, so that's malformed, not well-formed. Tag names cannot contain any of these characters, so this is a correct, everything has correct characters, but in this case we have an element with the H+1, which is one of these reserved characters that are not allowed. There needs to be a single root element, so in this case we have HTML as the root element and a terminating HTML is the terminating element. In this case, this is malformed because we have the start tag, the root element that starts and ends, and then we have another element that starts and ends outside of the root element, so that's malformed. There's a lot of rules with well-formed, so if you just bear with me. No attribute may appear more than once, so the paragraph, correct, we have one attribute called style. That's correct. In the incorrect, we have a paragraph with a style attribute and another style attribute, which is malformed. Reserved characters ampersand must be escaped. Hint, hint, this will be in the quiz. So in this case, if you see an ampersand, you have to have a semicolon. Same with this, there's an ampersand LT for less than and semicolon. So that is correctly escaped. In this version, there's a bare ampersand, which is not escaped, so that's malformed, and a bare less than sign, which is not escaped, so that's malformed. Content must be delimited with a beginning and end tag. In this case, we have a beginning and end tag. That's correct. In this case, if this were just the only tags in the XML, we would see this empty text here that's not within a tag, so that's malformed. And also there's empty text at the end, which is malformed. Attributes delimited with single or double quotes, that's good. So in this case, we see paragraph with double quotes, that's good. But in this case, we see paragraph with no quotes, and that is malformed. Contains only proper Unicode characters. There's a range of Unicode characters. This is within that range. This is not within that range. I'm not going to ask you about this on a quiz. You don't have to worry about that. I'm just leaving it in here for completeness. All entities except for the ampersand, less than, greater than, apostrophe, or quote must be declared. And the way you do that is that you, for example, we say entity university, Portland State University in the doc type declaration. Then when we refer to this ampersand university semicolon, that's what we call a declared entity. In this case, we have not declared the entity, so this is an undeclared entity, therefore it is malformed. Okay, so that's a bunch of stuff about well-formed. Some of that will be on the quiz. I know I went through it rather quickly. Hint, hint, if you have the slides with you in the quiz, it'll make sense. So let's look at this next exercise. We're going to test well-formedness. We're going to create in our workspace, we're going to unzip the XML folder, and it's going to, there's a little thing that happens sometimes when you unzip folders. It creates extra folder names, so we're going to have to be careful about copying just the contents of the XML and then pasting it into our XML workspace. And then we will copy the simple.xml and put it in our Notepad text editor. And then we'll test for well-formedness by going to this URL, and then we'll copy the text from our text editor and paste it into this URL, and we'll click the validate button, and we'll observe that there are no errors. And then we'll also use the file upload method, and we'll validate this, and we'll find that there are no errors. So let's escape out of this, go back to the first step. I'm going to escape out of this, and I will do all of these steps. So I'm going to go into our downloads directory where we downloaded the all of our stuff from our resources, and I'm just going to go ahead and extract the XML, and I'm going to extract all, and I'm going to say OK, extract it right here. Okay, and it made this directory. Okay, so if I look in here, this is the case where it actually made an extra directory, and lo and behold, it made an extra directory. What I really want is just these three directories, so I'm going to Shift, copy those, Control C for Mac or for Windows, Command or Apple C for Mac. So now I'm going to go back into my WT4CP folder, and I'm going to paste all of those files right here in my XML directory. Okay. Then the next step is to open in my text editor, close all of these, so I have a fresh text editor. Okay, so I'm going to open my simple.xml file in my DTD directory. Okay, so I have that in on my notepad. I'm going to go to this URL. Okay. Okay, so you can do the same thing And as I said, it's important that you do this. So it says place copy of your XML here. So I'll go into the text editor, and I'm be careful to select only this text. If there was a carriage return here or a line feed, I would not select that. Okay, so I've copied that. I'm going to paste that here. Control V for Windows, Apple V for Mac, and then I'm going to press the validate button. Unfortunately, that's an unfortunate name, validate. It's because we're not really validating against the DTD, but nonetheless, it's a free tool, and we see that no errors were found. If there were errors here, for example, if I'm just going to intentionally create an error here. I'm going to put an escaped ampersand. And if this is not part of your exercise, by the way, I'm just showing how the tool works. When I get down here, oops, no errors were found. Made me a liar. Oops. Okay, let's just do this. This is not part of the exercise. I just want to make a point here. Go here, and I'll actually type in. And I think that there was something in memory there, so HTML blah. And I'm not going to terminate this correctly. And I'm going to try validating this. Let's see if it catches it. Yeah, see, it told me that there's an error there, that the A must be terminated with an end tag. So that worked as expected. So I'm going to go back into here to go to a fresh starting point so I don't have any memory errors or anything cached in memory. Okay, so we did that step. We pasted, we hit the validate button. No errors were found. And now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do the file upload method. So let's go back to the site. And we will choose our file. W. Okay. XML. DTDs. File. Simple XML. Open that. Okay, so it has that in memory. It has the file there, and we'll validate that. And it tells us no errors were found. Okay, so I'm going to go back here. Check that. Okay, check my calendar. My next meeting starts at 3:30. Okay, that was not part of our lesson. Okay, so we went through that step and we did that. Okay, so that was well formed. I know we hit the validate button and that was a little bit confusing, but so far all we were checking for is well-formedness. Now we're going to talk about valid. XML files with a doc type declaration or a schema declaration must validate against their DTD or schema. For this class, we will only discuss DTD validation and only the very basic structures. A file without a doc type declaration does not have to be valid. So for example, this simple document that we just looked at does not have to be valid. It does not have a DTD, does not have a doc type declaration. In this case, we have an example of an internal DTD, an internal doc type declaration. So here we have our XML declaration, and we have this thing, doc type class, and then it actually has the DTD right in line, and it says that this document then has to start off with a class element. The class element has exactly one P element, and the P element is made up of PC data or text. So that's an example of an internal DTD, which happens to be valid. An external DTD is different. An external DTD has either a system, in this class it has a system identifier, it gives you the name of the DTD, and it tells you where the DTD resolves. In this case, it would have to be in the same directory as the XML file. But you notice there aren't any rules here, so it's referring to an external DTD. The external DTD, as I just said, it gives us a name, a system identifier, and it tells us where the DTD is. Okay, so this is the external DTD. In fact, if we opened up the example, we would see exactly this. So the syntax is we have an angle and an exclamation point and the word element, all uppercase, space, and then the element name, space, and then what can be inside this element. So in this case, we have exactly one introduction followed by exactly one conclusion. The intro, oops, I said introduction, I meant intro. And these are case sensitive. So the intro has PC data, parsable character data, which is just text, and so does conclusion. We've also defined an entity here called university, and its value is Portland State University. Okay. So let's do an exercise that looks at valid doc type declarations. So we're going to go through these steps. We're going to copy the PSU class element. We're going to paste it into the same tool. We'll press the validate button. It will prompt us for a DTD. When it prompts us for the DTD, we will open the PSU class DTD and we will copy. Oh, I see what I'm saying here. We're not opening anything. We're actually copying from the slides. I hope I put those slides in here. Yes, I did. And then we'll paste the DTD in there. We'll hit our continue validation button, and we'll observe that there were no errors. Okay, so let's go back to the start. Okay, so we're actually going to these slides. So it says to copy this slide. So I'm going to go up to this slide, and I'm going to copy this slide. Okay, Control C. Go back to our website, and I'm going to paste that here. Control V, and I'm going to backspace so that I don't have this extra line feed. Okay, and then I'm going to validate. Okay, and it tells me here the file psuclass.dtd is being referenced. Please copy it here so the validation can continue. Okay, so I'm going to go into my slides, and I'm going to copy the DTD. I'm going to paste it in, and I'm going to backspace so that extra line feed isn't there, or carriage return. Okay, so I'm going to continue validation, and no errors were found, and it evaluated the XML document and the DTD. Okay, so now I'm going to put backspace to get myself into a good position here. Okay, so we did that. Hopefully, and again, please do pause the tape. I said tape. Pause the video, and actually, please make sure that you do this. Okay. So we went through these steps, and everything worked just fine. Okay. So the DTD syntax for sequences and choices. In an elements content model, we can indicate that the child elements must occur in an order with a comma. So in this case, doc must contain exactly one start, one middle, and one conclude. Or we can indicate that a child, get back into presentation mode. We can indicate that you have a choice of elements. That's with the pipe. So in this case, doc can contain exactly one start, exactly one middle, and exactly one conclude, but they can be in any order. So that's referred to as the next thing we'll refer to as cardinality. So in each of those examples I just gave you, those things must occur exactly one time. that would be no indicator. If the indicator is a question mark, then they must appear 0 or 1 time. If it's a plus sign, that's 0 or more times, and if it's asterisk, then that can appear 0 or more times. Mixing text and elements. If we say that doc can have either bare text or intro or conclusion, that's done by always putting PC data first, followed by a pipe with the other elements, and the asterisk goes outside of the parentheses. Parentheses. Okay. Attribute syntax in DTDs are a little bit different. Attributes can be assigned in several data types and default values. For this class, we'll only deal with C data, which is text, character data. Attribute declarations include the element name, the attribute name, and the attribute type, and the attribute value declaration. So in this case, we have attribute list for doc. The element doc has one attribute called number. It's C data, and it's implied, which means it's optional. In this case, the attribute list for intro, for the element intro, it has two attributes. One is version, which is text, and it's required, so that means we must have version. And one is number, and that's text, but it's implied, so that's optional. Okay, so putting it all together, we have a document with the element declaration of exactly one start, one or more middle, and exactly one conclude in exactly that order, and it has an attribute of number, which is optional. The start tag has its own character data. It can have either a paragraph or raw text. It can have, it's required to have an attribute called version, and it has an optional attribute called number. The middle element, again, has either text or a paragraph. It has no attributes. Conclude has exactly one paragraph, so that means it can't have raw text. And the paragraph, or the P tag, has parsable character data or text, which means it cannot have any elements. Okay, so this is valid. It has all of those things that I just said. Doc has exactly one start, one middle, and one conclude in the right order. The start has, doc has the required attribute, start has the required attribute. It has a nested P tag. Middle has both a nested paragraph tag and raw text. That's fine. And conclude has exactly one paragraph tag, or P tag. This is not valid because the DTD allows exactly one start element, and we have a second one there. And also, the start element is missing a required attribute, which is version, right here. Hint, hint. This might end up on the quiz. Okay, so that's valid versus well-formed. XSL. What's XSL all about? XSL is Extensible Style Sheet Language. There's the URL where you can learn more about it. It's a family of recommendations for defining XML file transformations and presentation, consisting of three parts: XSLT, which is for transforming XML, XML path language, XPath, used in XSLT or XSLFO to access or to refer to parts of an XML document, and XSL formatting objects, or XSLFO, for specifying formatting semantics. This is very useful for creating PDF files. The word style sheet gives an unfortunate limiting connotation. XSL is the standard with which DITA is published, XLIF is published, and HTML is published. Why do we care? Content providers more and more create content in DITA. Their tools are transformed. Their tools transform the DITA to HTML and PDF. DITA projects are transformed to output in nearly all cases via XSL. There are no 100% foolproof transformations that will work in all scenarios. Despite how well your team or your vendor writes the XSL, there will very likely be cases where the code will need to be adjusted. Content providers manage content translations using XML tools and standards. DITA and HTML often transform to XLIF via XSL. Translated XLIF is often transformed back to DITA or HTML using XSL. Okay, so how does it all work? The XSL workflow is as follows. You begin with a source XML file and a desired target or text format. you write the XSLT that will transform the source to the target. Apply XSL processing. Sometimes this is automated via an XML tool, or sometimes we do it via the command line. You'll probably almost never have to do it via the command line, but I'm going to, for this class, require that you know how to do it via the command line, just so that you'll be able to do the troubleshooting if a problem does occur, and then you observe the resulting file. So this is an example of a simple command line transformation. We have a working directory. We have an XSL processor. In this case, it's called saxon9.jar. We have the source XML file, and we have the XSL script file. And from there, we can use the command line to create a target output file. So if we have this source file, class.xml, it's just plain XML. You notice that this is not HTML. These are tags. These are not HTML tags. We have an XSL script that transforms. So we have, this is called the identity transform. And then we have, in this case, it says if you find a PSU class element, transform that to HTML, apply templates. Then if you have an intro, turn that into a P tag. If you have a conclusion, turn that into a P tag. If you have an emphasis, turn that into a B tag. It's a very simple XSL. Okay, so then you would enter the command line processor, Java -jar saxon9. So this is the command line. You're calling Java jar to call this XSL processor. Then you have a -o for output. Class.html is the output that we want to create. Then the next one is the input file, which is class.xml, and the XSL transform, which is class.xsl. Okay, the resulting file will be an HTML file that when you look in the browser looks just like a HTML. Okay, so this will be our final exercise. Let's create the XSL workspace. So we'll navigate to the XML/XSL directory. We'll observe the class.xml file by opening in the text editor. We'll observe the class.xsl file by opening it in a text editor. We'll invoke the command line, and then we'll navigate via the command line to that directory. The way you do that in Windows is you can, depending on what version of Windows, it's under Accessories, Command Prompt. In the Mac, it's under Utilities, and it's called Terminal App. In Windows 10, you go into your Windows system and find your command prompt there. There are some very good tutorials on how to use the command line, but if you follow along with me, you should be okay. So then you type in the command line Java -jar saxon9 -o class.html class XML class XSL. If you get an error, that means you need to update your Java JDK. You should go to oracle.com and find the latest version. I can help you with that. Don't worry. If you have a problem with that, don't worry. I can help you. And then you observe the new class.html file by opening it in your text editor and then in your browser. So let's go through those steps. Okay, so where were we? We're down here. We're going to do this. So we'll navigate to our, I'm going to put this away. Put that away, XSL directory. So we're going to XML, XSL, and we're going to look at our class.xml and our class.xsl. So I'll pull up my text editor again. I put this old one away from the last exercise, and we'll look at class XML. And indeed, we have PSU, intro, and conclusion. And then I'll look at class XSL. And indeed, I've got all of these things that we looked at a minute ago. So then I'm going to invoke my command line. So I'll go into Windows. All apps. And scroll down to Windows. System, and go get my command prompt. Okay, so there I have it, and I'm going to pwd to see where I am. Oops, no, it's dir in Windows. Okay, so I'm going to cd to my desktop, These are the same steps in Windows or Mac. I'm going to do a dir. In Mac, you actually do an ls. So in Mac, I would have typed ls, but of course in Windows that doesn't work. So now I'm going to cd into Web Tools for Content Providers. Okay, and I'm going to look at that. And I'm going to cd into XML. I'm going to cd into XSL. I'm going to do a dir. And I'm going to see that I have that. So then my command line was Java space minus jar Saxon 9. Oops, don't want to. 9.jar space minus o class dot html space class dot xml space class dot xsl, and I hit across my fingers, hit enter, hope for no errors. I got no errors, and indeed it made this new file. Where is it? Class.html. I'll look at it, and indeed that is HTML. And if I open it up in my browser, it looks like HTML. Looks like a web page. So that concludes today's class. I know I went through that rather quickly. Please do the exercises, and you should be just fine. If you have any struggles at all, please just let me know. Thank you. That concludes today's class. Let's see if I remember how to turn off this control.